All right. Good evening, everyone. Can you guys hear me in the back? Yes? Yes, you can just wave. All right. Great. Sorry, just having a few technical difficulties, but we're just going to jump right in. So we're continuing in our lecture series on CRAVE. And one of the interesting things I learned about this particular craving that people had was that a lot of people mentioned the issue of fear. They wanted to be free to just do the things that they wanted to do. They wanted to be able to have adventure, to actually step out into the unknown and engage some of the parts of their lives that they usually keep dormant. So what I decided to do was to introduce our topic tonight by talking about the top 10 fears. Now, there's a lot of debate on what these fears are. Sorry, I don't know why this keeps doing this. On what the top 10 fears are. Okay, it's going to do it again. Why does this keep doing this? Keeps trying to switch to another program. Oh, I closed it. Okay. So I think it should be good now. Yes, ma'am. Okay. So we're back in business. So I wanted to introduce the topic by talking about what are the top 10 fears, and there's a lot of debate on what these are. So I'm going to do them in reverse order. So the number 10 fear is the fear of losing freedom. A lot of people are actually afraid of things like, being kidnapped or being taken to a concentration camp, as this is a picture of barbed wire in the winter. A lot of people have severe anxiety about losing the opportunity to be free to do what they want to do. So they even choose their careers centered around the jobs and the businesses that give them the most liberty to do what they want to do. Number 9 was the fear of the unknown. A lot of people are afraid of things that they don't know. So if they feel like, well, what are you going to do after graduation? Or who exactly are you going to marry? Are you sure that this girl or this guy is going to remain faithful to you after you begin the relationship? The unknown haunts a lot of people, and it's the number 9 fear in the world. The number 8 fear is the fear of pain. A lot of people are afraid to suffer at all, on any level. Emotional pain, but we'll get into more specifics throughout the presentation. Pain is a big fear around the world, number 8. The number 7 fear is the fear of disappointment. A lot of people have a people-pleasing, what I would call a syndrome, so to speak, a complex. And we sometimes suffer to make the right decision or to end a bad relationship or to go the direction that is truly in our hearts to go because we're afraid of someone that we're going to disappoint by making that decision. And so the fear of disappointment is also very prominent. The next fear is the fear of misery. A lot of people are afraid of being in a situation where it goes so bad and so south that they can never get out of it, and they feel this sense of misery that is around them. And I found this one to be interesting because I was like, the fear of misery, and I'm wondering if these are people who've actually been in misery or they're just the anticipation of it in their minds, which is a great part of what fear is. The next one was the fear of loneliness. Now, we're not surprised by that because yesterday we talked about love and relationships as the number 4 thing that students at the University of Michigan crave. The fear of relationships, or I should say the fear of loneliness, is a big fear, and it keeps a lot of people out of a relationship, and it also drives a lot of foolish people into relationships just because they don't want to be alone. We all know that girl that has to have another boyfriend or that guy that has to be dating someone all the time. And a lot of times that's driven by the fear of loneliness. The next one is the fear of heights. A lot of people won't go to the edge of the Sears Tower, or when I was in Dubai, the tallest building in the world, which is 1 kilometer high in the air, the Burj Khalifa. I mean, people don't want to get to the edge of that window, because literally, if you go to the Burj Khalifa and the sun is below the horizon, and you take the elevator to the top, you can completely see the sun. That's how high it is above the earth. So at the top, it is still sunny outside. At the bottom, it's almost dark and nighttime. But the heights is a very big one. I actually have this fear personally. When I was in the United States Marine Corps, in the 4th week of boot camp, they said, yeah, you're going to have to go down this rope from this helicopter hovering in the air. And I remember looking at the guy, and I was like, there's no way I'm going to do this. And then, he started yelling in typical boot camp fashion. And I said to myself, well, I can either sit here and listen to this guy roast me in front of everybody else, or I can go down the rope. So obviously my fear of ridicule was a little bit greater than my fear of heights. Another big fear is the fear of rejection. A lot of people are afraid of kind of putting themselves out there, right? This is why guys and girls like to play that friend zone with benefits for a while before they actually come out and say, I'm interested, or I like you, or I want to be with you. This is a real big problem. And so the fear of rejection is one that drives a lot of people. Number 2 is the fear of death. A lot of people are afraid to die. And some people think about it a little more often than others. Other people, they only think about it at certain particular times in life. Maybe when they're ill, maybe when they go to the funeral of another loved one and they're thinking, man, what am I going to do with my life? Is it going to matter that I live? Which we looked at on Monday. The fear of death is a very big fear. The number 1 fear in the world is the fear of failure. I was surprised by this one. Because when I was counting down, I was trying to figure out, I'm like, hey, what is the greatest fear in the world? If you go to the United Kingdom, which is one of the only variances of this, is their number 1 fear is public speaking in England. But the number 1 fear is the fear of failure in the world. Now, I want you to think about the fear of failure and what could not have happened in the world, what could not have happened in society had individuals who are innovators, who are scientists, who were engineers, who were social activists, if they did not allow themselves to be free from the fear of failure, and they continued to try anyway. For example, I live in the beautiful state of North Carolina, and Lord Kelvin had said in 1895 that flight might be possible in 100 years. That was in 1895. In 1903, in October, all the major scientists in the world said, guess what? The likelihood of flight with aircraft that's heavier than air would take 10 million years. October 1903. Well, guess what? On December 17th, 1903, Orville Wright flew the first plane. He powered it 120 feet on a beach in North Carolina. That was 2 months after they said it was completely impossible. You and I both know that if Orville Wright was constrained by the fear of failure, he would not have accomplished one of the greatest transforming inventions of our time, which is the airplane, air travel. Think about the globalization that has resulted from the creation of the airplane. Think about the idea of Federal Express. Being a businessman myself, you can think to yourself that, man, I need to send this package all the way to China, but with certain services, because of the airplane, you can literally get same-day service. I mean, it's mind-boggling that you can send something in China at 12 p.m., but because we're 13 hours behind them, by the time it arrives, direct flight, I'm actually getting it when they sent it. It's almost as if you emailed it, except it just costs you a lot more gas. The fear of failure is serious. And when we talk about a life with no fear, I believe this is the real fear of which we are speaking. We're not just talking about no fear of heights. We're not just talking about no fear of, fear of loneliness or the fear of death, because that would be the ultimate failure, right, of life. But we're talking about something at the very core of why we do not pursue our dreams. One of my frustrations as a speaker, especially to young people, is that young people have lost the desire to dream. They've become cynical, and they've also become sometimes overly optimistic, and I would even say a little bit, Looney Tunes in the head with some of the things. But let's talk about some people that are dreaming. This is Regina King. She was the leader of DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency for the government, and she was essentially, this is a picture of her sharing in her TED Talk about how they were working on an airplane that can actually fly Mach 20, which is 20 times the speed of sound. And they had literally flown a plane from New York to Long Beach in 11 minutes and 20 seconds. You know, the problem that they had was not flying the plane at that speed. The problem was landing. They would just crash in the ocean at enormous temperatures of heat. They said this thing is not sustainable. But their goal is to be able to create an aircraft so that you can go from one point on the earth to any other point on the earth in 1 hour. I said, man, as a person who globetrots myself, I love this woman. I hope they achieve their goal. Her dream is my dream. I'd love to get anywhere in the world in 1 hour and not have to experience the jet lag. One of the fascinating things that DARPA is working on right now is they're working on this particular micro chip that is about the size of a nerve fiber to insert that into your body to help your body recover from particular illnesses. Completely brilliant stuff. But of course, you're not going to achieve these things if you are constrained by the fear of failure. We can learn this lesson when we think about children. You know, one of the reasons why children are so happy and that the world is filled with wonder for children is because they don't understand the fact that certain things are impossible. You know, I remember when I was in Darmstadt, Germany, and my oldest daughter, Naftali, we were there. She was, I don't even think she was 1 year old yet. And you know, one of the things that's interesting about kids, right, is when you play with a kid, and my daughter was trying to run from me, and then I would grab her legs and she would fall on the bed. And after you play with a kid and you do something one time, what do they say? Do it again, right? So then she tries to run, I trip her again, right? She falls on the bed, she laughs, she thinks this is great. My dad is tripping me into the mattress. This is the best thing since sliced bread. After about 20 times, you know, as an adult, this gets a little boring after a while. Okay, I need to move on. I'm trying to save the world. I have speeches to prepare. So I trip my daughter, she falls, she laughs, and I'm thinking, okay, it's all over. But this time, the girl thought we were still playing. She went head first, frontal lobe, into the concrete wall of the apartment. And I literally almost blew the top. I said, oh no. I thought my child was dead. She was going to have brain damage forever. I was going to go to jail. My wife would hate me for the rest of my life. But the crazy thing was, when I looked at that situation, I learned something. I learned about the fact that in her mind, right, she thought that I was going to trip her. And even if I wasn't going to trip her, she was not worried about the concrete wall that was right there at the edge of the bed. In her mind, everything's going to work out. Everything's going to be fine. No particular fear of failure at all in her mind. And this is what allows her to enjoy life and to have a sense of wonder. When we talk about a life with no fear, I believe that we're talking about the fear of failure. We need to be free from this particular fear. You know, another story that really popular speaker likes to share about his son named Nathan. And he tells a story about how Nathan was playing with balloons. And these helium balloons, right, they would come and they would float up to the ceiling. Then he would climb up on the couch and he pulled the balloon down. Then he would come back and then he'd let the balloon go and it would bounce on the ceiling. And then he'd jump on the couch and pull the balloon. I mean, he thought this was great. He just kept laughing every time he saw the balloon rise and bounce off the ceiling. And then all of a sudden, it entered into Nathan's mind, I'm going to take this thing outside. So he takes the balloons, runs outside while his dad is talking, releases the balloon thinking that it's going to hit a ceiling. But it just keeps going and going and going. And before you know it, his 3-year-old mind, it finally struck him, that balloon is not coming back. He started crying and screaming. So his dad comes over and he's like, hey, what's wrong? What's wrong? And he says, oh, Daddy, the balloon. And he looks up and he realizes, oh no, he brought the balloons outside. And then after he finally calms down his son looks at him and he says, oh, it's okay, Daddy, I know. The next time you're in the airplane, you can bring it back for me. Now, obviously, he says, I'm not going to turn to my son and say, hey, you know, when you're flying at 40,000 feet, they don't let you open the door. Because in the child's mind, they cannot see why this is not possible. That's why the child would say those kinds of things. But for us, we say, well, I know better now. I have more education now. But just because we're more educated, just because we're more knowledgeable, just because we're more experienced, doesn't mean we have to let go of dreaming. doesn't mean we have to be constrained by the fear of failure. Here's the question that I want to ask you. What would you attempt to do if you knew you wouldn't fail? This is ultimately the key to living a life with no fear. What would you attempt to do if you knew you couldn't fail? I want you to create a mental list in your mind. What would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? Now, as you think about that, let me share with you my list. I said the first thing I would do is I would learn to play the piano. Always wanted to play the piano, but in my mind, I'm like 35 years old. I'm too late, right? If I go to any piano teacher, can you teach me to play piano? She's like, oh, this kid, by the time he learns it, he'll be dead. And, I'll take his money, $50 an hour. But in my mind, if I knew I couldn't fail and I knew I could learn, I just would love, how many times I've flown through Heathrow Airport, and there's this beautiful grand piano there, and I'm like, man, I would love to be able to just land, drop my carry-on bag, sit at that piano, and just be able to play a beautiful piece of music. That's what I would do if I knew I couldn't fail. Another thing I would do, I would sing. And, some people know this would be a miracle if I was able to sing, because my wife can sing, but I'm so bad I wouldn't even say I can't sing, right? I just say I shouldn't sing. That's the way I describe it. And there's Sam Smith, right? If I had a voice like his, my wife would love me forever. Another thing I would do if I knew I couldn't fail is I would play the cello. Cello is one of my favorite instruments. I went to the Detroit Symphony Orchestra about 10 years ago when I was here in Ann Arbor, and I remember watching this woman, this girl who was 17 years old, world-class cellist, play that cello. I was like, man, this is amazing. After that, the instrument earned my respect. And I thought to myself, I should try to play the cello. Then my wife, trying to help me pursue my dreams, rented a cello, never touched the thing, did one class, never finished because of, again, the fear of failure. Another thing I said I would do is I said, I would have my own plane. If I knew I couldn't fail, I would just buy my own private plane. Delta, nice seats, everything. Just have my own private plane, be able to use that for all the different trips that I need to take, business, service, and otherwise. Now, I want you to think about your list. What did you say you would do if you knew you couldn't fail? And based on what you said in answer to those questions, ask yourself, how many of those things are you doing? If I look at my list, I'm not doing any of those things. Now, as I'm thinking about the fact that all the number of things that you put in your mind and you said, man, if I knew I couldn't fail, this is what I would do. And you're not doing any of those things. This is how you know that you are constrained by the fear of failure. You are boxed in. This thing is keeping you from doing certain things in your life. Because if you did not have the fear of failure, you would be pursuing them. And it's because of the fear of failure that we are robbed of our joy and of our wonder in life. This is what leads us to a boring life. Because when we are constrained by the fear of failure, you know what picture that paints for us? It gives us a picture of a life where amazing things stop happening. It gives us a picture of life where we never achieve the impossible. It gives us a picture in life where there's a loss of wonder and nothing but regret. I remember when I was in middle school and I played basketball. And I remember I grew up in a Jewish community outside of Chicago. And I remember being on the basketball team. Everybody assumed because I was the only black kid, I should be the best player on the team, right? But that's not the case. So at the end of the game, we came down, we were playing this game, and we were only losing by 1 point. So at the end of the game, it was counting down, right? That's like the dream shot. 10, 9, 8, 7. They're like, Sebastian, shoot it, right? I shot the ball, completely missed it. We lost the game. Next day in school, everybody was like ignoring me. So I'm like, hey, what's going on, Sally? Nah, man, you missed that shot. We should have won that game. I was so devastated as a 12-year-old kid that I said, you know what? I'm never playing organized basketball again. Never play. And I literally quit playing basketball. I'll play on the street. I'll play over on the playground, but I would never play organized basketball again. And all because of why? Because I failed. And it was that fear of failure that constrained me, that kept me from doing what I knew I wanted to do. Come down, son. You got to go back with mama, okay? Go ahead, son. That is an example of no fear of failure. That leaves us in a life where we end up having all these regrets. And I look back now in my love for basketball, and I'm saying to myself, man, why did I not push myself? Why did I not push through the failure of that particular moment? Why did I allow myself to be constrained by the fear of failure? And of course, my wife tries to comfort me. She said, of course, she's like, babe, you could have played professional basketball. We all know that. Don't worry about it. Even though we know that's not true. Let me give you some examples as I bring this talk to a close. When you think about Tori Murden McClure, maybe you've heard of her, maybe you have not. She wrote a book called Where She Found Her Heart in the Middle of the Ocean. This woman wanted to be the first woman to row across the Atlantic Ocean. She was a professor at Spalding University, and now I think she's the president. While she was rowing across the Atlantic Ocean, she rowed into a hurricane. And there she was in the middle of the ocean on a rowboat in the middle of a hurricane. And she survived and swam, literally rowed across the Atlantic through the hurricane. This is the woman, Dawn Lourdes, who wrote a song who called Tori one of her heroes. She said this song is dedicated to a woman who rowed herself into a hurricane in order to accomplish her dream, because she would not be constrained by the fear of failure. If you go and you start rowing on the Atlantic Ocean, there's always going to be a reason to turn back. There's always going to be a reason to go back. There's always going to be a reason to say, let's try a different day. This is not a good season. This is not a good time on the waters to go. But in her mind, she refused to be constrained by the fear of failure. Another individual, Mr. Neri, this guy does free diving. Maybe you've never heard of it. But free diving is basically people who jump into the ocean and they try to go as far down as they possibly can in one breath. So they take a breath, then they jump, and they go down. This guy actually has the world record, 125 meters, all the way down and all the way back up in one breath. It's amazing stuff. And he explains what literally happens to your body as you're going down. He says, as you jump into the water, he says, at first, you're feeling the cold. You get this shock that happens to your body. Then he says, all of a sudden, your lungs basically harden, and you can feel it in your body, and all this blood rushes into your lungs to harden them to protect your chest cavity from caving in. He says, then as you get to about 100 meters, which they used to say, there's no way you could free dive farther than that, but he says, now we know better because there was a movie called The Big Blue, where it's about the story of the guy who basically broke that record. He says, once you pass 100, at that point, he says you feel so much pressure on your body that your temptation is to resist the pressure. But he says this is when free diving becomes complete and absolute bliss and peace. He says it's in that moment when I feel the pressure trying to cave in my body and I want to resist it. He says, but you have to do the opposite. He says you just let the pressure come. And he says, I just let it constrain me and constrain me and constrain me, but I keep diving. And he says, I'm falling so fast, he says, I almost feel like I have a protective barrier. And it's like the ocean is just pulling me down. He says, then when you get to the bottom, he says, at that point in time, he says, you feel almost like you're floating in space. You can look up, you can look left, you can look right, you can look down. It's all complete darkness. And then he says he realizes he has to go back up, but because that same pull that brought him down is still present, he has to swim twice as hard in the same breath. As he starts swimming back up, he says 30 meters below is when his diving team meets him to escort him back, because that's when the temptation, right, to do different things that cause you to spit up blood or to cause your lungs to collapse if you don't manage it properly. So as they bring him up to the surface, he says all of a sudden he can feel the blood rushing out of his lungs. His body begins to relax. He takes in the first breath from all that time of diving, and he says, you don't understand what it feels like to hit that surface and just breathe in all that oxygen. And you know the crazy thing he says? He says when you're down there at the bottom, they begin this thing called nitrogen narcosis, where you begin to lose consciousness of reality. And this is people who are wanting to pursue their dreams. And the fear of failure did not constrain him. It's like nitric narcosis. This guy's literally hallucinating at 125 meters under the ocean. But he says you have to keep it together. so that you can go back up to the surface. And when you get up, in order for the judges to validate what you are doing, he says you have to take off your nose piece and wave so they acknowledge he's conscious, so that it actually qualifies as a legitimate dive. And that's how he broke the record. Because he would not be constrained by the fear of failure. Let's see if we can get this back up. We're good. Next is Tim Ferriss. You probably heard of him, the 4-hour work week. Basically, Tim Ferriss says this. He says, if you smash fear and learn anything. And you know how you do that? He says, by asking yourself the question, what's the worst thing that could happen? He says, when you're looking at something you're considering, he says, ask yourself, what's the worst thing that could happen? You'll be surprised what you're willing to do when you actually assess what is the worst thing that can happen. This woman is from Gaza. Her name is Amira Haruda. She's the one that actually escorts journalists into the actual battlefield in Gaza so that they can interview. And she literally helped journalists interview the guy that kidnapped a particular British journalist there in Gaza. She was also taken with them, and she said it was the scariest day of her life. She takes a picture of her kids every day that she goes to work because she doesn't know if she's going to be able to make it back. But she says she wants the story of Gaza to be told. That is her dream, was to pursue something to be able to tell the story of her people, to not only show the damage and the suffering, but to show the beauty of her people. They actually have one of the best music schools on the continent. But there's a woman who is not constrained by the fear of failure. She says, don't limit your challenge, but challenge your limits. Don't allow others to stand in front of your dreams. I want to end with this. When we were going to the moon, a lot of people said it was completely impossible, and DARPA was started because the Russians had launched Sputnik into space. That's when DARPA was started. And when John F. Kennedy was basically pushing for the space program, people don't know that the only reason why we made it to the moon was because of a deadline. He said, look, we must launch by this time. Because we were racing against these people to say they launched this satellite in there, we can't let them be the first one. Because of the deadline, they pressed and they pressed and they pressed, and they did the impossible, and they literally put a man on the moon. But you see, Thomas Merton challenges us to not just dream in terms of innovation, in terms of these extreme sports such as free diving, in terms of bringing the story of our people in a conflict-laden area of the world out so that voices that are usually drowned by the media are heard. But he says we should also dream in the areas of human relationship. And this is what he says. He says, what can we gain by sailing to the moon if we are not able to cross the abyss that separates us from ourselves? It's amazing. It is amazing that if I meet people inside of a conference or networking, they feel like they can benefit from a business relationship with me, and they say, oh, that guy over there, he works with a film studio, or that guy over there, yeah, he runs a health tech business. You should go network with him. Maybe you guys can do some synergy. But if we just see each other walking in the hallway, we will never bridge the abyss that exists between strangers. We'll never stop and see someone. We'll never go and say, hey, let me just go ask you not, let me help see how you can help me accomplish my dream, but what if I went to people just to find out what are your dreams and how can I help you accomplish your dreams? This causes us not only to see that we're constrained by the fear of failure in terms of our profession, in terms of our dreams, but even in terms of human relationships. If you want to live a life without fear, you must live a life where you decide that I'm going to pursue something, not because it's easy, not because it's accessible or because it has been done, but I'm going to pursue it because I can sense that my fear of failure is constraining me. And that's when amazing things start happening in your life. We're going to take a break for some pizza and soda, and then after that we'll reconvene.